Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video, with me having not too long ago done my Survivor top 10 worst player of all time, this time we're going to be doing the same thing but for Big Brother US, which ends up being a pretty different list in my eyes. Where Survivor, I feel like the top 10 worst players for Survivor are usually people that were voted out at the first opportunity. While I don't necessarily think that's the case with Big Brother, I mean, Big Brother is a game that just in general has a lot more variance to it due to the ability to directly control the game comes from competitions, and competitions in general are very variant. So with Big Brother here, I did approach this list a bit differently. Instead of this being a list filled with people who went home at the first possible opportunity, I mean, even though there are still a decent amount of people that do make the list, that isn't necessarily the criteria that I looked at. Where I feel like a much more major piece of criteria is how actively bad are these players in terms of how much did they actively do to put themselves in the position to where they go home relatively early. Again, there still won't be any like super late boots on this video. I do want to do that video at some point where I do my top 10 worst Big Brother players that made the jury. I feel like that would be a fun idea down the road. But for this one, again, it is still players that did not make the jury, but a lot more of these people aren't necessarily the first or second boots, though they all did play really actively bad in my eyes. Before getting into the main list, I do have a number of dishonorable mentions, and a decent amount of these can be grouped together. First up, we have a grouping of people who did play very actively bad. For me, didn't quite make the top 10. People like Amanda Hansen from BB9, Allison from BB9, and Annie from BB12. Brian Hart is the first boot from BB10 that I did consider, but I do feel like he showed a lot of potential there. And despite him being a first boot that did completely do it to himself, there was at least a point where he was fully controlling Jerry's HOH. I feel like that is at least somewhat impressive. Also consider someone like an Andrew from BB12, who I kind of lumped in with Mike Lubinsky from BB5. As these players who at least have some level of game knowledge. Again, they are capable strategic thinkers, but they're just so unable to really blend in with whatever cast they're given. And because I do look at them as bad players, but again, that game knowledge is what kept them off the top 10. We obviously have a grouping of players who didn't really even get much of a chance to really play. Obviously, Jody being the most notable of these, but you also have like a Megan from BB19, Glenn from BB18. You have Justin and Scott, who are both expelled, who again, all these people were in consideration but didn't quite make the list. I did consider Pow Pow from BB16, where, I mean, she was bad, but I feel like she wasn't as actively bad. I mean, yeah, she did do some bad things in the game, but those things didn't necessarily backfire on her to those being the reasons why she was voted out. I feel like the biggest thing with her is that she was just too passive in the game in terms of making game relationships, to where she just had no one really on her side outside of like a Donnie and Jocasta, who weren't really going to do much for her. But in terms of the worst players, I feel like there are a lot of other players that more so did it to themselves than Pow Pow, who is just someone that was looked at as like a massive pawn and someone that was just so easily nominated as collateral damage. We also have a few first boots that were in consideration that I just don't have much knowledge on them in terms of how they actually played. So we got like Amanda from BB4, Ashlea from BB6, and Carol from BB8, where again, like, I don't think they played actively bad. It's just that they, again, played too passively. And again, I just feel like there's other people who've played more actively bad. Also have another grouping here of players that, again, like, just didn't really build any real social bonds, to where, again, they were just taken out due to no one really caring about them in the game. So you got like an Autumn from BB2, Michelle from BB4, Holly from BB5, kind of a Jillian from BB19, though she kind of had more allies, but again, same thing. Obviously, Lawan is someone that I know people are going to mention. However, for me, Lawan played okay until he went home. It's just that he made one big, massive mistake that caused him to go home. But even then, like, that mistake was prompted by something that was a bit abnormal to begin with production giving them this weird clue. And even then, again, like, I think Lawan, despite him being in the Minority Alliance for a decent amount of the early game, like, he still does rebound decently well up until that point. So I don't think he's the worst of the worst. I also consider Mike Dutz, who, again, similar thing of making a really terrible move where he really provokes Evil Dick to the point where Dick decides to put him on the block when he was like completely safe that week. But while that is a bad move, again, I don't think he necessarily played poorly. up to that point, even though, again, like, it's not like he played great, but to me, it's like that was a one-time instance in comparison to the players that we will be talking about that made multiple bad moves throughout the season or were earlier boots than him. I did also consider Brent from BB23, largely because of how delusional he was in the game, but at the end of the day, again, not nearly as bad as the people we will be talking about, because at least there were a couple things that he did right in the game, namely getting Frenchie to not target him that first week, but again, overall, still pretty mediocre. And I did kind of loop him in with Michael from BB6, who was another one that was kind of a similar level of douchey, but also played really poorly as well, but didn't quite make it on, largely due to the fact that he did at least have a few allies and did make some alliances along the way. And the final grouping we'll be talking about is this grouping of players who, to me, were in consideration at a point, but at the end of the day, they had a solid group of allies that wanted to keep them around despite the fact that they were first boots. So obviously, the most notable of these probably being Jose, but we also have like a Keith from BB13, David Gurton from BB15, and then Braden from BB11, who I think all of them are bad players, but again, they at least had their allies that wanted to keep them safe, so they didn't quite make the list. But there we go, those are all the dishonorable mentions. Now let's move on to the top 10, and number 10 for me was a bit tough. I did question whether this was the right pick, and again, realistically, it's number 10. Who really cares? But at number 10, on the worst players of all time for me, comes from BB21, and that person is Bella. And I did struggle with this because, like, technically speaking, Bella was part of the majority alliance. Like, she was for the first, 2 weeks of the game. They do eventually flip against Nick and Bella, but she's able to stay safe due to Nick winning HOH. But she is then later eventually taken out. And again, she was part of the majority alliance. She did play actively. She did make numerous alliances within the game. And she was someone that had people that wanted to keep her in the week that she went home in Nick and Sam. The reason why she is number 10 on this list is because I have no faith in her ability to keep any of the alliances that she ends up making. I mean, this is the thing about Bella is that I don't remember how much of it was on this show, but she is the type of player that would make alliances left and right, but then continuously rat those alliances out and sabotage her own relationships for seemingly no reason. And we had that situation with Kemi where she had a very strong bond with Kemi to where Kemi thought that they were ride or dies, yet she just throws Kemi under the bus for seemingly no reason, which was pretty poor gameplay there. Her alliance just simply didn't trust her, despite the fact that, again, she started off strong. She had a 3-person alliance with Jack and Jackson. She created this alliance with some of the women in the house. She was all over the place for half of week 1 and seemed to be in a decent spot, but then she just actively sabotaged her game left and right. And I feel like that's the type of player that I'm talking about with this list, where to me, I feel like more actively bad gameplay is more indicative of a poor player on Big Brother than actual placement or being taken out at the first opportunity, because whether or not you're taken out the first opportunity on Big Brother is largely dictated by competition results, which are, again, extremely high variance, while someone like Bella is someone that, again, wasn't taken out at the first possible opportunity, but is someone that I have no faith in not sabotaging her own game at every possible opportunity. And for me, that is worse gameplay on Big Brother, where there is so much variance involved, where someone like her that's going to mess the game up for herself is a lot more predictably bad to me than you being able to predict who's going to win competitions and who they're going to target and all these other things. So for me, that is the reason why Bella and similar players like her moving forward will end up being on the list here, and she is here at number 10. Now at number 9, we're moving on to another recent season. Here we are coming from BB20, and here we do have Kaitlyn Herman. And for me, Kaitlyn's another situation. Again, one that made the wrong move at pretty much every single opportunity. Another person that was in the majority alliance at the beginning of the game. Again, she was part of Falte, and through subsidiaries, they did have the majority. And coming into that first round, where it was Steve versus Sam, again, Steve, someone that she considered like her father, or Sam, someone she barely had a relationship with, it should have been a clear-cut case of, oh, she's going to vote out Sam. But Tyler is so easily able to manipulate her, using Sam's power to put fear in her to where she decides to go against her alliance, being the sole individual to go against her alliance and vote out Steve. Again, really bad gameplay from her end, but then to move forward, Tyler further manipulates her into backdooring the leader of her former alliance and someone that she had a good relationship with. So she ends up backdooring Swaggy. Again, 2 really bad moves back to back, only for it to later be fodder for the level 6 alliance, where she isn't roped into the plan to get rid of Winston and is completely tricked by level 6 into believing it was one of Falte that turned against them. But then also in the following round, when level 6 had the opportunity to save her in the vote, they just decided not to. Mind you, there was an attempted flip and it was turned down due to certain members not being on board. But again, like for me, it's like Kaitlyn just actively sabotages her game left and right, and it's just so easily manipulated in the game to where, again, Tyler really just controlled her game up until that point, while also building this perception that they were a duo, while also making people think that somehow Kaitlyn was the bigger threat of that duo, and her really taking the fall for a lot of the things that he was doing in the game. I mean, you can also factor in the puzzle at the end, which not really indicative of gameplay in Big Brother. I mean, that's also bad, right? So, I mean, overall, I just think Kaitlyn's a terrible player as well. Again, another one that I just have no faith in her actually being able to play well on any given season. So just here at number 9. Now, number 8, we're moving on a little bit further back. And here we're moving on to BB17, another player that is in this similar sort of tier, and that is Audrey Middleton. And Audrey's another one that I have no faith in her to not actively sabotage her own game. Again, like she's someone that had so much favor early on in the game and was someone that was very well liked early on, but then she just had to actively ruin it by just simply overplaying. And I do think she gets lucky that she was on a cast that was pretty strategic, and with people like Shelly and Vanessa around, they realized that it was easier to keep Audrey around as this big target for other people to be focused on, while they go ahead and take out people who are bigger threats to them. And I think if it wasn't for that, she probably would have been the second boot of the season. But even then, like, she continues to sabotage her game over and over and over again, to where they really just had enough and just said screw it and got rid of her in week 4 because she just wouldn't slow down. I mean, like, it really, again, like, Audrey's just another one, like Bella, like Kaitlyn. I just have no faith in her to not sabotage her game. And the reason why Audrey is above Bella and Kaitlyn for me is because with Kaitlyn and Bella, like, they were taken out by people who weren't really in their own alliance. Audrey was taken out by her own alliance, largely because of, again, like, her playing so actively bad. And to me, that is worse when your own alliance is actively making the decision to put you on the block and take you out of the game. So that's why I did end up having Audrey here at number 8. Now, number 7, we have another player from BB17. We actually have the first boot of the season, the first boot we're going to be talking about, and that is Jace. Now, I was a bit surprised Jace ended up making the list, but to be honest, I think Jace is essentially a worse version of this grouping that I talked about in the dishonorable mentions, like the Joses, the Keiths, the Davids, the Bradens. I think Jace is in that tier, except he didn't have the allies behind him. Again, all of those people had allies that wanted to keep them safe and were part of a sizable minority alliance. Jace had almost nobody. Like, he had Austin, kind of had Liz and Julia, but they were one player at the time. But again, like, he barely had anybody. And also, he's another one that, like, actively sabotaged his own chances of surviving after he was nominated. Now, again, like, to actually get nominated to begin with, I don't think he did that much actively bad outside of just, like, come off as a threat. But once he's on the block, like, the way he campaigned was in a really condescending way. And there's this really notable scene of him campaigning to Steve, where he really is just berating Steve the entire time. And while it does end with, like, Steve still considering keeping him around, like, it was just indicative of how poor of a player I think he is. So really, I have no faith in him ever being able to get out of a situation after he faces adversity. And I feel like he is pretty likely to face adversity pretty early on if he plays the way that he played in BB17. So because of that, don't have much faith in him as a player. He's here at number 7. Now number 6, and we're finally getting to some of the more notable bad players in the history of the show. At number 6, from BB16, we do have Devin. I did question how bad Devin really was when going through this process, because obviously Devin's a bad player. But the one credit I will give him is that he does technically form the bomb squad, which does become the majority alliance for pretty much the rest of the game. Though, really, it's like, what's the point of forming it when like he's not the one that actually like formulated the strategy that they end up utilizing to maneuver through the game. But also, the way he formed it was deeply flawed, specifically with the addition of Christine and Amber, him adding in alliance members without even telling the other people in the alliance. That's kind of insane. He was going to be the target coming out of week 1 due to how aggressive he was playing in the game, but gets saved by the fact that he wins HOH. But even then, he continues to spiral in the game, where he does end up targeting Zach, who was someone that was within his own alliance. He does do these backhanded deals and doesn't really live up to them with people like Paula and, to a degree, Brittany. And even then, he saves Brittany eventually, despite them being on really bad terms at the point that he saves her, to take out Zach, who is someone that was within his alliance, only to fail in getting him out because he didn't secure the numbers well enough. Again, like the first 2 weeks of his game are pretty historically bad. However, the reason why he is as low as he is here is because I actually do think Devin has more potential than the 5 players we'll be talking about afterwards on a return. I do feel like Devin, in his last week, I actually thought he played okay. It's just that he was already in a position where he was pretty much doomed. Again, like Derek was HOH. Derek had a pretty solid plan to backdoor Devin. Devin didn't really have a shot at staying, but even then, I thought he brought up a effective campaign against Caleb that I did think would have been solid if he hadn't already blown all of his relationships beforehand. So really, to me, that screams out to me that I think there is something there on a return. Again, like coming into the season, people were high on Devin. People liked Devin. He seemed like a genuinely nice guy in his interviews. It's just that once he got in there, I think he just lost his mind. I think by the time he got humbled with Zach staying, I think that's when he started to realize what had gone wrong and tried to correct it a bit, but it was just too late. But I feel like he has more potential on a return than any of the people we're about to be talking about. So that is why he is above them here at number 6. Now, number 5. This is someone that has been compared to Devin quite a bit. And I did have a debate between the two over which one is worse, but obviously I went with this person. So at number 5, we do have Frenchie from BB23. And again, this was pretty close, but I think it really comes down to that. As I said with Devin, that I think Devin has more potential on a return than Frenchie. I think they both played pretty poorly, obviously. Frenchie's another one that like was making deals left and right, creating numerous alliances for no real reason, making promises he didn't need to make, went back on those promises over the course of his HOH week. But the thing about Frenchie that I will give as a pro as opposed to Devin is that Devin came out of week 1 being the target. Frenchie came out of week 1 not being the target necessarily. Like he was not the person that was going to go home in most scenarios. It was actually Brent instead. However, due to getting a somewhat unlucky HOH result in Kaitlyn, but also due to his own actively poor gameplay, he does become target in week 2, which further cements to me that I just have no faith in him to ever play optimally, kind of similar to my opinions of like an Audrey or a Bella. To me, Frenchie's kind of like the male version of that, but also has demonstrated that he can't even survive a single round without having some sort of immunity, without blowing up his game. Again, like the week they came out of not being directly targeted was a week where he was HOH, and then the very next week he instantly makes himself a target by going around and telling people that the slaughterhouse is done and blowing up his alliances for no reason. And it's that complete downfall at the first opportunity he didn't have a level of safety that makes him worse to me than Audrey and Bella. And it's also the lack of potential moving forward that puts him above Devin. So for me, he lands here number 5. Now number 4, we're moving back to BB16, and we have the first boot from the season. We have Joey. Now I will admit that I think Joey is probably someone that probably has more potential on a return than a lot of the people that we've already talked about. However, I feel like her singular season that we've seen was just so actively bad that I can't really ignore it. Like her game week 1 of BB16 is pretty terrible, where she does try to form this all-girls alliance very early on that pretty much instantly blows up, and she ends up taking pretty much all the blame for the creation of the alliance and also admits to creating the alliance, which makes her a pretty big target. to the point where they decide they have to backdoor her. Again, you have the backdoor Joey, of all people, in a position where she ends up going home unanimously. Again, it is a bad first week of the game, especially when she doesn't really effectively campaign. She kind of also shows herself as really crazy, where she starts playing as Alex, which I think just led to even more confusion, which kind of made her look like even more of a loose cannon. So for me, this is a pretty historically bad week 1 of Big Brother, but again, I think at the end of the day, I see a level of potential there on return. I don't think she's always going to play this poorly, but because this first week was so bad for me, it had to land her here at number 4. Now number 3, we're moving back to an older season of the show. Again, if you haven't noticed, a lot of the top 10 here end up being from recent seasons of the show. I mean, everyone that we've talked about so far have been post BB16. However, the remaining 3 are all pre BB16. And this one comes from everyone's favorite season, BB9. Here we do have Jen, who I feel like has been forgotten as an all-time bad player in Big Brother. I mean, she is someone that, again, kind of follows the same mold as an Audrey or Bella, where she just plays so actively bad and sabotages her own game at pretty much every opportunity. She over-strategizes, or people are sketched out by her. She also really annoyed a lot of the players that were there, made up continuous lies for seemingly no reason. She even threw her own boyfriend under the bus, which, I mean, that entire situation does make it a bit wonky, where, again, she did come into the game with her boyfriend in Ryan, who was paired up with another woman while she was paired up with a guy. And again, this is the season where there was the pairs twist, which was just dumb. But she is single-handedly the reason why her pair goes home. I mean, her and Parker were technically the first duo voted out. I mean, there was the power couple twist, which they were the power couple. So, I mean, they even had immunity during that. But really, Jen put the target on herself. And, I mean, again, this entire Ryan situation does make it a bit iffy, because part of the way that she ruins her game is by feeling the need to tell people about her relationship with Ryan, which ends up backfiring on her and makes her and Ryan massive targets for that first week. But again, along the way, she just sabotages her game left and right, to the point where she starts telling people that Ryan is a racist in order to try to get people to flip on him, which makes her look even more sketchy that she's willing to go that far to stay in the game, and it really just makes it even worse. I mean, to me, I just feel like Jen did pretty much nothing right over the course of the season, and is someone that I think is a historically bad player that kind of gets forgotten about. So for me, she does end up landing here at number 3. Now number 2. Back to someone that's a bit more notable. I mean, kind of in line with the Devin and Frenchies of the world. At number 2, we do have Willie Hantz from BB14. And again, for me, he is essentially of the Devin and Frenchie mold, but also with a lot less potential in the game, with really no prospects by the time that he is targeted. Like those other players, he continues to make deals for no reason. He is a really bombastic player, a player that gets too cocky, and really one that goes on this massive power trip, to the point where Janelle and Mike Boogie end up working together to keep Frank in the game so that Frank can go after Willie. And that entire situation is already bad, but again, the way that Willie handles this by getting into a massive argument with Frank in the middle of the backyard and tries to intimidate people to vote his way, and then also how he handles the week afterwards, where obviously he gets into a fight with Joe and gets expelled. I mean, that's obviously bad as well. Though pretty much by that point, his fate was sealed. I mean, he was pretty much going home unless he won veto, which more than likely wasn't happening, especially against Shane, who was pretty much always winning that comp. So in that aspect, Willie's already bad. But again, for me, the thing that differentiates him from Frenchie and Devin is the fact that I just feel like Willie is just never going to do well, and really had no potential to even have anyone by his side by the time he went home. Where if we're looking at Devin, again, Devin, as I said, I think had potential in his last week. I think he has potential on a returning season. Frenchie, despite how bad he played, wasn't the target coming into that week, and also had certain people that did technically want him around over Brent, at least. Yeah, I mean, you had a Tiffany, a Big D, a Brittany. I mean, there are people that wanted him to stay, while Willie just had none of that. I mean, even by the time he loses HOH, even Brittany, his own coach, wanted him gone. And JoJo and Shane were disassociating themselves from him. I mean, to me, that is the major difference here with Willie, to where Willie just literally had nobody by the time he left the game. And I just can't imagine him ever playing well. I feel like he is such a bull in a china shop, to where I can't imagine him ever doing well in a game of Big Brother in particular. So because of that, for me, that lands him here at number 2. Now, number 1, the worst player of all time from Big Brother, is someone that I have talked about in the past. I still stick by this. The worst player for me is Jacob Hurd from Big Brother 9. Now, Jacob was the first boot of his season, along with Sharon, but again, pair twists is BS and BB9. But this is a situation where Jacob just made so many unforced errors over the course of 2 days, I believe it was, that caused him to be taken out, where he could have literally just sat back and done nothing and he would have been safe. Again, there was already a massive target on Adam and Sheila, to where they would have been the easy people to take out, but Jacob just couldn't shut up and ends up targeting Parker, who is part of the power couple, this couple that has the sole vote to evict the next day. Yet Jacob just, for some reason, starts talking about how sketchy Parker is to Adam and Ryan, and with Ryan obviously being paired up with Jen, which again, this is something he couldn't know about, but still, I mean, like, the information gets back to Jen and Parker, to where he becomes the very clear target at this point. But then they even try to do a house meeting and try to call him out, and he handles the situation so poorly, where he just makes himself look even worse by not owning up to anything, or not even just trying to deviate the target onto someone else. He literally takes a lot of the brunt of the blame without even owning up to doing it. Like, at least if he owned up that he was doing it, it still would have been bad, and he still probably would have been booted. I do think it ends up like endearing him a bit to the other people in the house. Again, not enough to save him. He still was going home. But for him to also do that while also not even bothering to throw anyone under the bus either, just made it so clear that the target was right on his back, to where he gets taken out the very next day. And to me, it's really just an astronomically bad move that pretty much encompasses his entire game. Like, that is his game. Like, his game is literally him going after the person that has the sole vote to evict, which is completely asinine. And I really can't imagine someone playing a worse game than Jacob. Like, how do you do worse than that? Like, it's really one of the dumbest moves in Big Brother history, and for that to be literally his only move, and the only move he had the chance to make, for me, that was enough for him to be the worst player of all time. But there we go. I mean, that is my top 10 worst players of all time for Big Brother. As I mentioned earlier, I would like to do a similar video to this, but only include people that were taken out after the jury, as I do feel like that would be a really interesting list in its own right. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.